There are three certainties in life: death, taxes, and Kazuha making your Genshin Impact account better. In today's video, I wanted to provide an updated guide for our favorite leaf-blowing character and discuss why he's still one of the best characters in the game. In today's video, I'll go over his kit, I'll go over his best weapons, I'll go over his best builds and artifacts, as well as touch upon his teams and constellations, and conclude with my overall pull priority for Kazuha. So let's get into it. Now let's start off with Kazuha's kit. Now Kazuha does have a rather robust kit. He definitely has a lot of different things working in his favor, but it is pretty easy to summarize and also to utilize. So let's start off with his skill, which is a very big part of his kit, Chiarabura. So Chiarabura is essentially the skill that you want to use pretty much at the beginning of your rotation. So I'll just demonstrate it real quick. So you launch into the air and then you plunge down. So the Chiarabura and the Midari Raizan, which we'll discuss in a minute, is that last part. And at that last moment when he plunges, he'll group enemies together, and he will also lower enemies' resistances as long as he swirls a different element. So it's important to note that not only does it base off plunge damage, so it is very important to level up your normal attacks because that's where his plunge multiplier is coming from. But it's also very important that you synergize his skill with swirling a different element. So Petch, as I'm sure you all are aware, Pyro, Electro, Cryo, and Hydro, it's very important that you use one of those types of characters, abilities, whatever it is, skill burst, to apply that element on an enemy, and then you use Kazuha's skill, because you'll see, based on his first talent, the Midari Raizan, if it comes into contact with a Petch element, it will deal an additional 200% attack, and it will be considered plunge damage. So again, it's very important that you level up Kazuha's normals. I think he is probably a character that needs to be triple crowned, which sucks. It is a lot of investment, but to maximize him, I do think it's very worthwhile to triple crown him. Because I can't tell you how many people I've seen with Kazuha that only level up his skill and his burst, and they don't even worry about his normals, and you are missing out on a pretty decent amount of damage. So that's his skill in a nutshell. You really want to apply a Petch element on an enemy and then use his skill to do a good amount of damage, group the enemies together, and then you come in with his burst. His burst is literally one of the best abilities in the game. Essentially, it reacts with a Petch element again, and it will create this autumn whirlwind that will deal this residual damage. I think it ticks. I don't know how exactly quickly it ticks, but it ticks and it does an instance of that damage. And it's important to note that there are certain override mechanics with each element. So Pyro is the top priority. So if you have a Pyro character in your team and you apply Pyro to an enemy, it's going to override any other element in that team, followed by Hydro, followed by Electro, followed by Cryo. So just keep that in mind when you're using different elemental characters, that if you're trying to, swirl Hydro with his burst, but you have Pyro applicated, Pyro will take precedence over Hydro. So it's just very important that you are mindful of that. Now, that's kind of Kazuha's kit in a nutshell. I'll touch upon a little bit more of it in a moment, but it's very important that, like I said, you level up his normals, because that's where his plunging attack multiplier for Midari Raizan is coming from. But all in all, it's very important that you pop his skill to get the enemies together and to do that instance of damage, based on reacting with the Petch element, and then you pop his burst, you're good to go. You're pretty much going to kill everything in your wake. Now, let's move over to his weapons. Now, obviously, Kazuha's best and sought weapon is his signature weapon, Freedom Sworn. Freedom Sworn is actually an amazing weapon. I wish I had it myself. It can be utilized on other characters for sure, but he does also have some pretty good 4-star weapons. As you can see, I have him equipped with the Iron Sting, which is a craftable weapon. It is a pretty good weapon. I definitely think his best and sought weapon is actually the Favonius Sword. We'll discuss, how to build around this weapon properly, but this weapon not only gives a ton of energy recharge, which Kazuha needs because you definitely want to be able to spam his burst on cooldown, but it'll also generate particles for your entire team. So all in all, this is definitely his best weapon. I know it hurts not having elemental mastery coming from his weapon, but Favonius Sword is so useful for not only Kazuha but your entire team. It's really hard to pass up. As we mentioned, Iron Sting is really good. The Tokubo Shigiri is also a very good weapon. Not everybody might have this weapon because it was an event weapon. And then sometimes you can get away with, using Sack Sword, if you have multiple R5 copies, but, Sack Sword is much more utilized by Xing Cho, and it's an okay weapon for Kazuha. It's definitely, not bad, but I would say, those are kind of his best weapons. And then obviously Zephos Moonlight, which is a gotcha weapon, is obviously super cracked as well, provides a good amount of energy for Kazuha, and it has an elemental mastery substat. So those are kind of the go-to weapons, I would say, for Kazuha. And then moving on over to his artifacts and builds, obviously as an animal character, you want Kazuha to be running on VV. If you're not running Kazuha on VV, you're significantly missing out on a good portion of damage and also just utility for your Kazuha. The 4-piece increases swirl damage by 60%, and then it lowers enemies' resistances of any element that's infused or any element that's swirled by 40%. So it's insane. If you're not running 4-piece VV on Kazuha, you're a dodo. I'm sorry. But there's really a couple different ways. I would say probably like 2.5 ways to build Kazuha. You can do a full EM build, which is kind of the standard and the easiest build. You're running a EM sword, and then you're running an EM sand, an EM goblet, and then an EM circlet. That's kind of like the easiest and go-to. I should say easiest. Getting EM main stats is tough. That's kind of one of the standardized builds. Now, obviously, if you're using a Favonius sword, you would definitely want your circlet to be of the crit rate variety, so you're proccing the passive as often as possible. You could obviously run an anemo damage goblet, but I do think you want Kazuha's elemental mastery to be as high as possible. I think an EM Sands is really non-negotiable. This is definitely a pretty standard elemental mastery Sands that you'll want to get on him. But 4-piece VV, get as much elemental mastery as possible, and if you're running Favonius sword on him, definitely get some crit rate. But that's pretty much it. I would say Kazuha is pretty smooth as far as building. And now if we move over to his constellations, now Kazuha at C0, a phenomenal character. He really doesn't need constellations, but his C1 is definitely very useful. You'll see I have it unlocked. Basically, it will reset the cooldown for your skill if you utilize his burst. So this can be very useful, in the Spiral Abyss because it's time centric. And if you're running up against the clock, you can use his skill. And then after you land, then you pop his burst and then you can use his skill again. So it definitely starts to exponentially amplify your damage very quickly. So I personally really saw the value in C1, so I went ahead and got it. I would love to get C2. C2 is absolutely insane. Basically, when you pop his burst, it increases his own elemental mastery by 200, which I'll show you in a second is insane. And then it increases the elemental mastery of characters within the field by 200 as well. So essentially, you're getting 400 total EM. And because of his second passive, upon triggering a swirl reaction, Kazuha will grant all party members a 0.04% elemental damage boost to elements absorbed by swirl for every point of elemental mastery he has for 8 seconds. So, obviously you're building a lot of elemental mastery on Kazuha himself. If you have a C2, you're getting an additional 200 for him. So he's going to boost up the damage of your team even more. I would say C2 is definitely just overkill. Everything's probably going to die before you even rotate to your other characters, but it is an insane constellation. C4 is fine. Definitely just gives him more elemental mastery. More energy recharge, which, is cool because you definitely want to be able to, spam his burst, but definitely I would say not as good as C1 or C2. His C6 is honestly insane, and if money wasn't a thing, I would definitely consider getting it. Basically just makes him a full-on Anemo DPS because basically he gets full-on Anemo infusion. So I would say if you're prioritizing making Kazuha as useful as possible and you have access to a decent amount of funds, C1 and C2 are definitely the main stopping points. Now, if we go into Kazuha's teams, I definitely don't want to spend a lot of time on the teams because legitimately his team comps are as long as the ending credits for all cinematic movies. Pretty much Kazuha can work with any flippin' team except for Geo and Dendro-based teams. If you didn't know, Dendro cannot be swirled, and then he's really not providing any utility to Geo-based characters as well because Geo can't swirl. So as long as you're not putting Kazuha in, Hyper Bloom teams or Geo-based teams. He's literally one of the best supports for any DPS in the game. I mean, I utilize him heavy in my Hyper Raiden team. He's obviously one of New Valet's best supports. You know, you can put him in a Ayato team. You can put him with a Child team. You can pretty much put him with any Petch-based team, and he will make that team significantly better. So, like I said, I could be here for another 40 minutes discussing which types of teams to run Kazuha with, but any Petch-based main DPS really wants to have Kazuha because he significantly increases their elemental damage. If we conclude with my overall pull priority for Kazuha, I know it's taboo to say characters in Genshin Impact are must pulls. And I'm not going to say Kazuha is a must pull, but I would say if we're ranking him on a scale of 1 to 10, Kazuha is a 9.5 or a 9.75 because he really brings that much utility to your team. I can't tell you how many instances where I've utilized Kazuha in the Abyss, and he's probably hard to carry. Like he does so much damage. If you just pair him with Bennett, like just those two characters, they will kill anything in the overworld. They will pretty much kill anything that's in an event. And honestly, in the Abyss, those two characters can kill probably 85% of the enemies. Obviously, they're going to struggle with, bosses that have huge HP pools, but, that's why you bring those two other characters. So Kazuha is as good a character as it gets. I can't recommend him enough. If you don't have him, I think he is an absolute game changer for, new accounts and also, veteran accounts. If you don't have Kazuha, he is an amazing, amazing pickup. You can't go wrong with him. But that's pretty much it. I just wanted to give my, thoughts on Kazuha, provide an updated guide. I hope this video helped. Comment down below if you have any questions or anything along those lines. And as always, I appreciate you all so much. Peace.